Pulling off a successful vanishing act is an unusual and difficult task, especially if you're a public figure of any variety. You'd think it would be impossible for a noteworthy celebrity to seemingly disappear into thin air, but as these missing celebrities have proven, anything can happen. If there's one thing to be learned from these missing celebs, it's that no one is too talented, popular, or successful to completely fall off the grid. Here's a look at some of the most mysterious cases of missing celebrities. Richie Edwards. If Lord Byron, Sid Vicious, and a moody teenager procreated, their spawn would probably look and act a whole lot like Manic Street Preachers rhythm guitarist and lyricist Richie Edwards, a mid-90s British rock idol. Edwards was handsome, moody, and dreamy, with a talent for writing lyrics about depression and an even bigger talent for disturbing publicity stunts. When a journalist with a music magazine implied his band's posturing was insincere, Edwards grabbed a razor blade and carved "For Real" into his own arm. When he first went missing, in February 1995, it could have been just another chapter in his twin stories of self-destruction and self-promotion. However, things took a turn for the worse when it quickly became apparent that the young poet was gone for good. After he disappeared from his hotel room, Edwards' car was later found abandoned near the Severn Bridge. Edwards was declared legally dead in 2008, but his body has never been found. Connie Converse. A 1950s musician, Connie Converse is now considered the first modern singer-songwriter, crooning intimate, lyrical ballads suffused with melancholy at a time well before Bob Dylan had made his mark. However, her contemporaries were not aware of how groundbreaking Connie was, and in 1961, she quit music altogether, virtually unknown and convinced she was a failure. In 1974, Converse wrote to her friends that she was going to make a fresh start, loaded up her car, and drove off into the sunset, never to be heard from again. No trace of her has ever surfaced, and it's generally thought Converse fell victim to suicide. Even sadder, Converse rose to popularity in 2009 when a handful of her songs were released on an album called How Sad, How Lovely. Unfortunately, Converse saw none of this success. Jim Sullivan. If Jim Sullivan's name isn't ringing any bells, that's because he's the definition of a cult artist. A folk rocker who was part of the LA scene in the 60s and early 70s, Sullivan cut just 2 records before disappearing. In March 1975, Sullivan was heading to Nashville for what was meant to be his big break. His car was found abandoned in the desert outside Santa Rosa, New Mexico. His wallet, clothes, and guitar were all found in a nearby motel, but there was no trace of Sullivan himself. According to a friend, Sullivan would have never left his guitar behind if he planned to vanish. Appropriately, for a dude who released a record called UFO, which featured lyrics about driving into the desert and being abducted by aliens, one of the more prominent theories is that he was, you guessed it, abducted by aliens. Rico Harris. In the year 2000, Rico Harris was on top of the world. He was playing basketball for the world-famous Harlem Globetrotters, and before that, he'd been a top 100 college basketball recruit. But drinking kept him from reaching his potential, and he wound up out of basketball and began working as a security guard in LA. The final blow came in 2014 when he was fired for drunkenness. He left his mom's Los Angeles home to drive to Seattle and stay with his girlfriend, but his car was later found abandoned outside Sacramento. Sources close to Harris confirmed he was known for disappearing for days on end, but this time he was in a weird mental state. A backpack and phone were found on the roadside, but Rico Harris was nowhere to be found. Days after Harris vanished, people were phoning in sightings of a giant person walking alongside State Route 16. Footprints were found in the sand, but there was no sign of Harris. The LA Times suggests he was probably picked up as a hitchhiker. After that, who knows? Jim Thompson. Jim Thompson is arguably the most famous American to have ever lived in Thailand. A former agent for the Office of Strategic Services, Thompson moved to Thailand at the end of World War II. He set up a silk business, single-handedly turning Thai silk into a global commodity, and was known to be a socialite, throwing huge parties for Bangkok's rich. In 1967, Thompson left Bangkok for a hiking trip in Malaysia. He set up camp in a bungalow, went on an afternoon walk, and never came back. Though Thompson was a soldier with field experience and the wherewithal to survive in the wilderness, he'd also made many enemies throughout his illustrious career, from competing businesses to the CIA, any one of whom would benefit from his disappearing. It's almost like a real-life game of Clue. Scott Smith. Canadian band Loverboy was one of the biggest rock bands of the early 80s, with hard-charging hits like Hot Girls in Love and Working for the Weekend. Scott Smith was a founding member, staying with the group all the way until his mysterious and frightening disappearance at sea on November 30th, 2000. After playing with his band in Vancouver, Smith and his friends set out for Mexico on a 37-foot sailboat. As they sailed down the coast and neared San Francisco, the weather got rough. A 20-foot wave knocked Smith off the deck of the vessel and into the water. Coast Guard helicopters arrived within 20 minutes and dispatched 2 search boats, which scoured a 133-square-mile area to no avail. Smith's remains have never surfaced. Barbara Newhall Follett. Prepare to feel like an underachiever. Barbara Newhall Follett was a jazz-age writing prodigy who published her first novel at age 12. That novel was The House Without Windows, a mega-complex work that won rave reviews in the New York Times. Everyone who read the book agreed Follett was going to be the next great American writer. But after putting out just 2 novels, Follett was forced to give up writing when her father suddenly ran off with a younger woman, leaving Follett and her mother penniless. By age 16, Follett was working as a typist and fending for herself. She never wrote again. In 1939, at just 26 years old, Follett had an argument with her husband and left the house. She never returned, and no trace of her was ever found. Her husband barely bothered to look for her, and her mother reportedly didn't discover her daughter was missing until 1952. Even stranger is the fact that the press wasn't alerted until 1966. By then, they were probably asking, "Barbara who?"
In 1990, Christopher J. Scarver was awaiting trial in a Wisconsin jail accused of killing 27-year-old job trainer Stephen Lohman. It was then that the arrest of a 31-year-old Milwaukee man was announced. He had the remains of 11 men and boys in his apartment. That man later confessed to killing a total of 17 men and boys in Ohio and Wisconsin. He also confessed that he would sometimes mutilate and cannibalize his victims. Scarver came to know of serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer much like the rest of America via the news. But Scarver got to see more of Dahmer than most people. Both men were convicted murderers serving out life sentences together in the Columbia Correctional Institution outside of Madison. Although Scarver was also a convicted murderer, he couldn't stomach the things he'd heard Dahmer had done. Scarver later told the New York Post that Dahmer would antagonize inmates by making food look like severed body parts and leave them for people to find. Scarver said he kept his distance from Dahmer until 1994. Scarver claims when the two were left alone in the prison gym, he bludgeoned Dahmer to death with a metal rod. He also killed another inmate at the same time named Jesse Anderson. According to what Scarver told the New York Post, Anderson and Dahmer antagonized him, so he killed them. Scarver initially pleaded not guilty of the prison murders, claiming insanity.
At his first court appearance, Scarver entered the courtroom singing.
Rain or shine, sharing your dreams, your heart and your mind.
But he later changed his plea to no contest. He did so in exchange for being moved to a federal prison instead of serving out his life sentences in a state penitentiary. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences on top of the first one. The insanity plea wasn't out of the blue. When Scarver was awaiting trial for killing Lohman in 1992, he told a psychiatrist that voices had urged him to commit that murder. Specifically, he said it was the voices of a family, a mom and a dad, a boy, and a little girl. Scarver shot Lohman in the head 4 times, then made a manager write him a check for $3,000. He also stole the manager's credit card. Scarver went to his girlfriend's home, where hours later, police found him sitting on the stoop of her apartment. He had the check, the credit card, and the gun he used in the murder in his pocket. Scarver told the psychologist he'd never been in trouble with the law or even been in a fight. He said the voices of the family told him everything was going to be all right and it was meant to happen like this. The New York Times reported that he said the voices also told him, quote, "I'm the chosen one." Scarver has been in jail or prison since he was about 20 years old. According to his webpage, he was placed in solitary confinement for 18 years after killing Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson. But he, quote, earned his way out and into a medium security prison. When he was initially arrested for murder in 1990, his girlfriend was pregnant and gave birth after Scarver was sentenced. The child was named Chris after his father, and the two maintained a relationship through letters, according to what his son told CNN in 2014. During his time behind bars, Scarver became a poet and wrote a book titled The Child Left Behind, Poetry of Christopher J. Scarver. Scarver also writes short stories, musical compositions, and songs, and creates art. He's proactive in writing prison policy proposals and initiated the American Prisoner Repatriation Act. Scarver also tries to encourage his son. In part of a letter the younger Chris shared with CNN, Scarver wrote, "Tough times don't last, tough people do, and you are the toughest kid I know." Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, the new Netflix movie about serial killer Ted Bundy, is pretty upsetting. It explores how Bundy fooled many of the people around him with his charm and good looks until all of his evil doing caught up with him. But here are some things the Ted Bundy movie gets wrong. A lot of what you see in Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile is a condensed version of real-life events. The fictionalized version of Bundy's capture and trial isn't all that far off from the truth, which makes sense considering director Joe Berlinger was already extremely familiar with all the gory details. It's actually his second Ted Bundy film. He also directed Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy Tapes, a Netflix documentary based on actual recordings of Bundy's confessions.
Creating the dim is not terribly difficult to do at all.
Since life doesn't move along at a brisk and tidy pace, any film based on a true story inevitably combines, embellishes, or pares down real events. For example, in Extremely Wicked, Bundy is arrested for the first time after a bag of suspicious evidence is found in the backseat of his car. His arrest is immediately followed by an interrogation, and then a scene in which Carol Durant picks him out of a police lineup. It feels like the whole process lasts for only a few days, but in actuality, charging Bundy was a much longer process. He was indeed pulled over in August 1975 when officers found handcuffs and other suspicious objects in his car, but they actually let him go because they didn't have enough evidence to hold him. It wasn't until Bundy sold his car the following month that police got what they needed to charge him with a crime. Authorities seized the car from the buyer and found strands of hair that linked him to some of the missing women they were investigating. Durant didn't actually pick him out of a lineup until October 1975.
When Ted was brought in for a lineup, he had changed his appearance completely from the few days before.
In Extremely Wicked, there's an initial trial for the aggravated kidnapping of Carol Durant, followed by an epic trial for the Florida State University murders and attacks. That trial takes place in Miami, and it ends with a conviction and a death sentence. But the real Bundy actually was put on trial 3 times, not just 2. Following a 1979 trial for the Florida State University murders and attacks, a separate trial in 1980 revolved around the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, who was reportedly strangled a month after Bundy's murderous crime spree at Florida State University. During the 3rd trial, Bundy pled not guilty by reason of insanity, but it didn't help. The jury returned a guilty verdict and he received a second death sentence. It's clear why Extremely Wicked omitted that 3rd trial. It would have felt redundant. But plenty of material from the final trial makes for fascinating viewing, and the filmmakers folded its major events into the trial we saw. That outlandish marriage proposal to a witness in open court? It actually happened at the Leach trial in Orlando, not Miami. And yes, that act made the wedding legal.
Will you marry me?
Your Honor.
Yes.
Ted Bundy and the woman he eventually married, Carol Ann Boone, obviously had plenty of conversations that nobody ever actually heard, so any dialogue between them in Extremely Wicked is highly fictionalized, if not completely made up. The timing of Boone's pregnancy in the film doesn't quite align with the facts either. Boone became pregnant during conjugal visits she made after he was convicted, not before. Boone divorced Bundy in 1986 and moved back to Washington with the couple's daughter and a son from a previous marriage. Some of Boone's acquaintances have said she felt betrayed by Bundy's eventual confessions. According to People, Boone stopped visiting Bundy during the last 2 years of his life. That's an understandable move, since it wasn't just about her anymore. By that point, she also had a young daughter to protect. One scene near the end of the film is completely made up. When Elizabeth Klepper visits Bundy prior to his execution, she shows him a photograph of the decapitated corpse of one of his victims.
What happened to her head?
Bundy tries selling her on some lame excuse, but she's not having it. So then he quite literally spells it out for her, and for us, writing hacksaw in the foggy glass that separates them. It's a shocking, emotional moment, but it didn't really happen. According to Cosmopolitan, there's no evidence that Klepper ever visited Bundy before his execution. Director Joe Berlinger even admits the scene is a total fabrication. What really happened is rather anticlimactic in comparison. Bundy's confession wasn't really a confession at all, and he didn't make it in person. After his arrest in Florida, he reportedly told Klepper over the phone that he was driven by, quote, a force. According to Vanity Fair, he told her, "I just couldn't contain it. I fought it for a long, long time. It got too strong." Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile is a film that generally keeps the cliches to a minimum. But one scene stands out for some alarmingly on-the-nose foreshadowing. Bundy and Klepper find themselves at a dog adoption center, and you'll never guess what happens next. This definitely didn't happen in real life. In an interview with Esquire, director Joe Berlinger says he included the scene because, quote, animals know. He added, when the dog did not get along with Bundy, that's a clue, but it's not like finding a knife. I did my own interpretation of having some clues along the way. In the film, Elizabeth Klepfer is comforted by her coworker Jerry, portrayed by Haley Joel Osment. Jerry eventually becomes Liz's protector and confidant, and he tries to help her see the truth about her monstrous ex-boyfriend. But according to Oxygen, Jerry isn't a real person. At best, he's a composite of several people she knew. It's likely that he's based on someone named Hank, a man Klepfer was romantically involved with for a while. In her memoir, Klepfer says she met Hank at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, writing, although we didn't have a lot in common other than our recovery from alcoholism, he made me feel safe. He began to stay with me even at night. Hank reportedly had a few altercations with Bundy over the phone, much like the one we see between Bundy and Jerry in the film.
Can you tell her that I love her?
Klepfer's continued correspondence with Bundy evidently became a point of contention between her and Hank, although no one really knows how their relationship panned out. In one scene in Extremely Wicked, Bundy gives Klepfer a copy of Papillon, an autobiographical novel by Henry Charrier about a man who's been falsely convicted of murder. Bundy is highly insistent that she read the book.
It's about this guy who's
Wrongfully convicted of a terrible, terrible crime, and he gets sentenced to life, but
he didn't do it.
Eventually, Bundy manages to give her a copy of the book as a gift, and at one point she's even seen reading it. According to Esquire, there's no mention of Papillon in Klepfer's memoir, and the storyline was likely invented to provide some more foreshadowing. John Malkovich plays Judge Edward D. Cowart, a character who's a little bit over the top. He calls Bundy nicknames, compliments his attire, and tells him he's good at lawyering. It turns out the real-life Cowart actually was a little bit over the top too. According to USA Today, a lot of Malkovich's dialogue actually comes directly from court records, including the odd praise he lavished upon Bundy toward the end of the trial.
You'd have made a good lawyer. I would have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went a different way, partner.
The film's name also comes from something Cowart said during Bundy's second trial, when he characterized Bundy's crimes as
extremely wicked, shockingly evil, vile, and the product of a design to inflict a high degree of pain.
But not everything Malkovich says comes directly from court documents. He reportedly improvised a line or two. For example, at one point, he admonishes court spectators after they cheer for Ted Bundy.
You are not waiting for the Flipper and Friends show at SeaWorld. It is a capital murder case.
Well, at least it sounds like something Cowart might have said, so at least Malkovich knew the character he was playing. Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile skims past a lot of Ted Bundy and Elizabeth Klepfer's life together. Based on the film, their relationship looks like rather smooth sailing. Birthday parties, snowball fights, bike riding lessons with Klepfer's daughter, the stuff movie montages are made of.
How the heck did you get so smart?
I get it from my mom.
You do, don't you?
What we don't see is the bad stuff, and there was reportedly plenty of it. According to Newsweek, Bundy was verbally and emotionally abusive. Klepfer's out-of-print 1981 memoir, The Phantom Prince, My Life with Ted Bundy, written under the pseudonym Elizabeth Kendall, paints a far bleaker picture of their relationship. Klepfer said he'd sometimes lock her out of the house, and he once threatened to break her neck after she confronted him about some items that he'd stolen. He reportedly physically abused her once, too. She writes, I was drunk. I couldn't remember what we were arguing about, but I kept telling Ted to go ahead and hit me, go ahead. Finally, he slapped me. However, she also denied that he was a violent person. When we argued, he was always calm and reasonable. I could count on the fingers of one hand the times that Ted had lost his temper since I'd known him. But Bundy reportedly did try to kill Klepfer once, and he even admitted it to her after he was arrested. According to E! News, Bundy left her sleeping on a hide-a-bed in front of the fireplace one night after she'd been drinking. Before slipping out, he closed the damper and put a towel under the crack in the door. Klepfer could have died from smoke inhalation, but she woke up coughing and managed to clear the smoke and put out the fire. In Extremely Wicked, Elizabeth Klepfer tells Bundy that she's the one who called the police and reported him because of his physical resemblance to a police sketch and the fact that he drove a Volkswagen, the same kind of car the suspect drove, according to eyewitnesses.
I'm the one who gave your name to the police.
In reality, Klepfer had much more than that to go on. According to Esquire, Klepfer found a number of items that potentially linked him to the recent murders and disappearances in Seattle. For example, she found plaster of Paris in one of Bundy's desk drawers. In her 1981 memoir, Klepfer wrote, "Now I keep thinking about the cast the guy at Lake Sammamish was wearing. What a perfect weapon it would make for clubbing someone on the head." She also reportedly discovered a hatchet tucked away inside his car. In the Ted Bundy tapes, Klepfer claimed she found a few pairs of women's underwear and a bowl full of other people's keys inside Bundy's apartment. In Ann Rule's The Stranger Beside Me, Klepfer also claimed Bundy kept a knife in the glove box of her car, revealing sometimes it was there, sometimes it was gone. According to Pop Sugar, actor Zac Efron wore fake teeth in order to portray Ted Bundy, with director Joe Berlinger telling the website, "The only thing we did is we put in false lower teeth to match Bundy's, because bite mark evidence plays a role in how he was ultimately convicted." However, modern forensic science has more or less rejected bite mark evidence. In fact, a forensic scientist told Oxygen, "To say that Ted Bundy is the source of this bite mark based only on a comparison of his teeth to the impression is a scientifically impossible statement to make." At any rate, Extremely Wicked gets that part of the story correct. The jury was very much swayed by the bite mark evidence. What the film gets wrong is the scene in which Bundy cross-examines Richard Souveron, the forensic odontologist who provided the bite mark testimony. It was actually Bundy's defense attorney, Ed Harvey, who tried to discredit Souveron, asking, "Analyzing bite marks is part art and part science, isn't it?" Souveron reportedly replied, quote, "I think that's a fair statement." That junk science may have been instrumental in convicting one of the world's most notorious serial killers, but it doesn't make it any less of a discredited practice today.
Judging by the sheer amount of documentaries and podcasts on the market, it's safe to say that true crime has become an obsession for many. Serial killers especially have attracted the attention of the morbidly curious. Here's a look at the traits most serial killers have in common. Most serial killers suffer from some kind of personality disorder, usually psychopathy or antisocial personality. The difference between these two disorders is simply nature versus nurture. For example, a psychopath's brain has underdeveloped impulse control and emotional centers from birth. By contrast, antisocial personalities are learned and usually develop during an abusive or neglected childhood. However, neither of these disorders equals insanity, which is why the not guilty by reason of insanity defense rarely works for a serial killer. Killers deemed criminally insane are not mentally able to discern right from wrong. Serial killers, however, know very well how evil their actions are. They just don't care. In his book, Real Life Monsters, criminal investigator Stephen J. Gianangelo calls the calm, purposeful behavior of a serial killer predatory aggression, comparing it to the aggressive behavior of carnivores. Predatory animals kill simply to satisfy a need. There isn't any rage behind the action. In other words, while other killers may kill because they are provoked, a serial killer kills because he truly believes he needs to. A person who has a predatory, aggressive personality believes other people are inferior, which makes it easy for him to justify hurting or preying on others. Serial killers don't have normal human empathy, but they're very good at pretending like they do. Therefore, it's up to the rest of us to learn how to recognize fake empathy when we see it. Simply put, if your instincts tell you someone is just going through the motions when it comes to exhibiting empathy, love, or concern, your instincts are probably correct. Listen to your gut. It's better to be safe than sorry. Most of us live our lives believing that the person sitting next to us couldn't possibly be a serial killer. That kind of stuff only happens in movies or to other people. We think we'd know if one of our loved ones was actually an undercover monster. However, the terrifying truth is that serial killers are incredibly skilled at twisting perception and controlling those around them like marionettes. They prey on the insecurities of those closest to them and masterfully manipulate loved ones to never suspect them of any wrongdoing. That's why the families and friends of serial killers are always shocked to discover the person they thought they knew as evil incarnate.
Just can't be. I keep shaking my head, saying, how can this be? Because he had lots of friends, very good student in school, a very normal, active boy.
According to Psychology Today, Jeffrey Dahmer's father simply accepted his son's lies at face value because it was easier for him to believe the lies than to admit to himself that his son was a monster. But even those of us who aren't already emotionally invested in a relationship with a dangerous person can be manipulated. Generally speaking, if someone appears to try and bribe you or distract you from flaws in a story using flattery, flowers, or gifts, you should definitely keep your guard up. Abuse during childhood is not a direct path to serial killerdom, but many serial killers were abused as children. A Radford University study looked at the childhood experiences of 50 serial killers and discovered that 68% of them had experienced some type of maltreatment, either physical, sexual, psychological, or neglect. An earlier study even reported that 100% of serial killers studied had suffered some kind of abuse in childhood. David Hosier of Childhood Trauma Recovery says psychological abuse in particular has a strong correlation with future behavior. Children who are shamed, humiliated, or punished disproportionately can develop a propensity for cruelty as a direct result of that abuse. Neglect is also a huge factor, as when children don't experience empathy from a parent or caregiver, they sometimes don't develop the ability to empathize with others. People who feel their own lives are out of control will sometimes look for smaller, more manageable situations to attain complete control over. If the person lacks empathy, that need for complete control may involve other human beings. Childhood abuse isn't the only factor in a person's past that can lead him to develop that oversized need for control. Kids who come from unstable homes, move frequently, or bounce around between foster homes may feel like they have no control over their lives, and therefore no time to develop real relationships with their peers. Not only do these children develop control issues, they also grow up with deficiencies in empathy. Combine this lack of empathy with a pathological need to control others, and you've got yourself a deadly combination. Serial killers almost always lack remorse. That's not really surprising, since the ability to repeat a brutal crime sort of depends on not feeling too bad about the first brutal crime you committed. However, a lack of remorse isn't necessarily specific to psychopaths and sociopaths. People who have fairly ordinary psychological makeups can also kill without remorse, provided they can successfully compartmentalize and dehumanize the people they kill.
It rubs the lotion on its skin, or else it gets the hose again.
But most of the time, lack of remorse is directly related to a killer's lack of empathy. If you're unable to empathize with someone who is afraid or in pain, you probably aren't going to feel much remorse about ending a person's life. According to Psychology Today, the most common type of serial killer is the power control process-focused killer. John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and the BTK killer Dennis Rader all fall into this category. Power killers can be said to have a sort of God complex. They kill slowly because the ability to decide how and when their victims will die makes them feel empowered. Most killers who sexually assault their victims aren't motivated by lust. They're motivated by the feeling of power they get from the act. One of the FBI's favorite techniques for interviewing serial killers is flattery. Psychopathic killers in particular tend to have a grandiose sense of their own self-worth, so investigators can use praise to get them talking. According to behavioral analysts, psychopathic serial killers don't respond to altruistic interview themes, meaning that trying to make them experience guilt or sympathy for their victims is a waste of time. Instead, interviewers might praise them for their intelligence or for their skill at outwitting investigators. Forensic psychologist Stephen A. Diamond calls this quality psychopathic narcissism and likens it to an immature, selfish, self-centered, resentful, and raging child inside a powerful adult body. Children are inherently narcissistic and must be taught the rules of social behavior, but when children grow up physically but remain in a state of immaturity, they can become extremely dangerous people. Parents might tell their kids monsters don't exist, but serial killers sure do. And while no one's managed to catch the boogeyman in the middle of boogieing, plenty of serial killers have been caught through the years. Here's how several notorious murderers were finally stopped. Richard Ramirez had a lot of creepy names, but the name that really stuck was the Night Stalker. From 1984 to 1985, the Night Stalker broke into homes across Los Angeles and murdered everyone in the house. He terrified an entire city, and his reign of terror came to a halt thanks to an unlikely hero, 13-year-old James Romero. It was a hot, dark August evening when the boy saw the Night Stalker in his backyard. Realizing he'd been spotted, Ramirez drove off in an orange Toyota, which the boy described to police. A few days later, police found the abandoned car and lifted a fingerprint. Ramirez's file was already in the system thanks to an earlier theft, and his photo was plastered all over the state. Ramirez didn't immediately realize his identity had been discovered, and when he finally saw his face on the front of a newspaper, he tried stealing a car to get out of town. He was in East LA, though, and the people of East LA don't take kindly to carjackers. Angry neighbors chased Ramirez down the street and beat him up. Ramirez died in 2013 from lymphoma after sitting on death row for almost 2 decades. Most famous serial killers end up behind bars, but there are a few who have escaped. For a while, it looked like the Golden State Killer had done exactly that. California was gripped by terror in the 1970s and 80s, fueled by the unpredictable violence of a serial killer haunting the state. This notorious serial killer would ultimately be linked to 13 murders and at least 50 sexual assaults across California, but continued to evade capture. One reason was because, at the time, DNA evidence was still decades in the future. Flash forward to the 21st century when California authorities decided to run some of the killer's DNA against profiles on a genealogy website called GED Match. And that's when they found a partial match, which meant they'd stumbled across someone related to the Golden State Killer. From there, it was only a matter of time before the police ended up on the doorstep of Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old ex-cop whose DNA was an exact match for the man who'd terrorized California for so long. Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the country's most notorious serial killers, who was ultimately connected to 17 murders. He was able to avoid capture for a long time, until, that is, he picked up Tracy Edwards. Once Dahmer had Edwards back at his apartment under the guise of posing for photos, the killer slapped handcuffs on his victim and pulled out a knife. Then, he started watching The Exorcist 3 of all things. While Dahmer was distracted watching the movie, Edwards bashed him over the head and escaped. He quickly found some cops, showed them the cuffs, and asked for help. Together, the two officers and Edwards went back to Dahmer's apartment, and that's where they caught a glimpse of some grisly photos. The officers grabbed Dahmer, cuffed him, and searched the rest of the apartment. They found much, much more than just photos, including severed heads, barrels of decomposing remains, evidence of cannibalism, and traces of 11 victims. In a bizarre footnote, Edwards' role in bringing Dahmer to justice put him in the national spotlight, and he was recognized as a wanted sex offender in Mississippi. In 2011, he was charged for another crime, throwing a man off a bridge and killing him. From 1976 to 1977, New Yorkers lived in a state of panic fueled by the serial killer stalking the street. He mocked the police while calling himself the Son of Sam, and as law enforcement tried and failed to catch the killer, the terror continued. It all ended one night in 1977 when Cecilia Davis took her dog for a walk. Davis was strolling through Brooklyn when a strange-looking man stormed by. He was walking awkwardly as if hiding something in his sleeve. Minutes later, gunshots rang out. Shooting victim Stacy Moskowitz died hours later, but Robert Violante survived the shooting. They would be the Son of Sam's final victims, because when Davis learned about the murder, she remembered the oddball barreling down the street and went to authorities. Davis also recalled seeing an officer in the area ticketing an illegally parked sedan. After looking into the ticket, the cops discovered the vehicle belonged to one David Berkowitz, who lived over 20 miles away from the murder scene. Thanks to Davis's tip, the authorities focused their investigation on Berkowitz, and he eventually confessed to the crimes. Between 1974 and 1991, the self-named serial killer known as BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill, took credit for killing 10 people. He disappeared for a while, but in 2004 he started up communications again, sending documents to local news stations and letting everyone know BTK was alive and well. BTK wanted to send all his letters to the police on floppy disks, but was unsure if the tech was traceable. He literally asked the police if it was possible, telling them to be honest. Obviously, the cops had no intention of telling the truth, and when the killer mailed his floppy disk, it was the evidence they needed. After opening a document, authorities examined the file and saw it had been saved by a Dennis and recently used at a nearby church. So when they learned that a Dennis Rader was a respected member of this particular church's congregation, they ran a DNA test. It came back positive, and BTK's reign of terror was finally at an end, all because he couldn't help but taunt the police years after he'd gotten away.
With no apparent motive, the serial killer who would come to be known as the Night Stalker attacked in the dead of night, savagely assaulting his victims. Richard Ramirez was a self-styled devil worshiper who killed at random. This is the horrifying true story of the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez was born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez in El Paso, Texas on February 29, 1960. His father, Julian Ramirez, a former police officer, was a stern man who had been physically abused by his father and grandfather and visited the same treatment upon his 4 sons. As recounted in The Night Stalker, The Life and Crimes of Richard Ramirez by Philip Carlo, Julian also turned his rage upon himself. Richard once witnessed his father beat himself bloody with a hammer. To avoid his father's erratic temper, Richard often slept in a nearby cemetery. A reclusive child prone to epileptic seizures, Richard became close to his cousin Miguel Ramirez, a decorated Vietnam veteran. Miguel regaled a teenaged Richard with violent tales and showed him graphic photographs of decapitations and war crimes. Ramirez would later quote his older cousin as saying, "Having power over life and death was a high. You controlled who lived and who died. You were God." In 1973, 12-year-old Richard watched his cousin kill his wife with a .38 caliber pistol. At age 13, Richard, unable to cope with his father's abuse, moved in with his older sister Ruth and her husband Roberto Avala. To Ruth's anger, Roberto, an obsessed peeping Tom, took Richard with him on his nightly rounds of spying in the windows of neighborhood women. Under the cover of night, Richard went beyond peeping and began breaking into homes just to see if he could enter and escape undetected. Initially, Richard Ramirez's drug use was limited to marijuana, which he began experimenting with at age 10. He began to use the drug more regularly with his cousin Miguel Ramirez. Miguel's killing of his wife seemed to flick a switch inside the troubled youth. He never told his parents he had witnessed the killing. Richard became more withdrawn and began getting into trouble at school. As recounted in Night Stalker, a shocking story of Satanism, sex, and serial murders by Clifford Leyendecker, Richard's late-night breaking and entering landed him in a youth camp for juvenile delinquents. At age 15, Richard managed to get a job cleaning rooms and carrying luggage at a motel, where he would perform break-ins and once attempted a sexual attack on an occupant. After 2 failed attempts at the 9th grade, Richard left school at 17 with no direction, a juvenile record, and a reputation as a thief. Soon he started using LSD, mushrooms, and peyote, and believed he was developing a personal rapport with Satan.
Hail Satan!
On April 10, 1984, 9-year-old May Leong and her little brother were playing in the apartment building where they lived in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. The little girl wandered into the building's basement looking for a lost dollar. May Leong's lifeless body was found hanging from a pipe by her brother. She had been repeatedly stabbed and strangled. Police, baffled by the lack of evidence, failed to identify a suspect, and the case went cold until 2009, when DNA evidence found at the scene was positively identified as belonging to Richard Ramirez. According to author Philip Carlo, Richard Ramirez was coming down from a cocaine high and desperate for cash on the evening of June 27, 1984. He had spent much of the night cruising Los Angeles' Skid Row in a stolen car when he decided to take the 10 freeway to Glassell Park, a neighborhood near Forest Lawn Cemetery. Searching for a house to rob, he settled on a shabby pink apartment building. His target was the first-floor apartment of 79-year-old widow Jenny Vincow, who had moved to Los Angeles from Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, just 3 years prior. Carefully surveying his surroundings, Ramirez donned a pair of gardening gloves and sneaked across the building's small courtyard. Vincow's window was open with only a flimsy screen between her and her killer. Unable to pry the screen off, Ramirez removed his gloves to make the job easier. Slipping through the open window, he carefully searched the apartment. Enraged when he found nothing of value, Ramirez descended on Vincow as she slept. He viciously stabbed the elderly woman, nearly decapitating her. The bloody era of the Night Stalker had begun. According to Carlo, Richard Ramirez bought a .22 caliber pistol off the street in March 1985. The small gun was easy to conceal and relatively quiet, and would be deadly at point-blank range. Clad in his customary black, he pulled down his dark blue AC/DC cap, with his favorite band's Highway to Hell album blaring over his headphones. He stole a car from a nearby gas station and followed 22-year-old Maria Hernandez to her Rosemead, California home. Under cover of night, he followed Hernandez into her garage. Closing to a distance of 2 feet, he fired at her. The terrified young woman instinctively raised her hands. Miraculously, the small caliber bullet ricocheted off her keys. Lucky to be alive, Hernandez slumped to the floor and played dead. Hernandez's roommate, Dale Okazaki, 34, wouldn't be so lucky. After she moved from her hiding place below a kitchen counter, Ramirez killed her with a single shot to the head. Fleeing the scene in his stolen car, an emboldened Ramirez followed 30-year-old Veronica Yu onto North Alhambra Avenue. While stopped at a red light, Ramirez entered Yu's vehicle from the passenger side. The killer shot her in the side and back. Hugh was pronounced dead on arrival at a nearby hospital. Believing he was working under the guidance and protection of Satan, Richard Ramirez went on a bloody rampage of assault, robbery, and murder throughout Southern California and San Francisco. Striking in the dead of night, Ramirez killed indiscriminately. The killer had no immediately discernible pattern or method in carrying out his crimes, leaving behind few clues, save for the mark of the inverted pentagram left at some of the crime scenes. Counting the early killing of May Leung, a total of 14 innocent lives would end at the hands of the Night Stalker. Among the dead were 64-year-old retired accountant Vincent Zazzara, shot to death in his sleep. Ramirez tied and beat Zazzara's wife Maxine before shooting her 3 times and mutilating her body with a kitchen knife. Many of Ramirez's victims were elderly. Sisters Mabel Bell, age 83, and Florence Lang, 81, were killed on May 29, 1985. Leaving his mark for the first time, the killer scrawled a pentagram on Bell's body and bedroom walls with lipstick. Lying comatose for 2 days before being found, Lang survived in a vegetative state, but Bell soon succumbed to her injuries. As recounted in The Night Stalker, The Life and Crimes of Richard Ramirez, a young Ramirez's obsession with Satan began at an early age. Growing up in a devoutly Catholic household, Ramirez understood God, Satan, heaven, hell, and sin as concrete realities. As Ramirez entered adolescence, his sexual fantasies began to focus on violence, bondage, and death. Yet his dark thoughts inspired guilt born of his religion. Soon, he came to feel that Satan would approve of his secret self, and perhaps the devil might be a more fitting deity for him to follow. At some point, Ramirez stumbled upon the writings of the Church of Satan's Anton LaVey and made a pilgrimage to San Francisco to meet him. The Church of Satan founder later told the press, "When I met Richard Ramirez, he was one of the nicest, most polite young men you'd ever want to meet." Yet Ramirez's brand of Satanism was a far cry from LaVey's theatrical atheism. By the time of the Night Stalker murders, he regarded Satan as a malevolent force to whom he was a willing servant. The more depraved his acts, the more his evil master would smile upon him and protect him.
This is a wicked, wicked world. And in a wicked world, wicked people are born.
Although stealthy, Richard Ramirez nevertheless left behind clues. Among the first was a single fingerprint left on a window screen belonging to victim Jenny Vincow. Unable to get a grip on the screen, Ramirez had removed his gloves. Ramirez also left behind a dark blue baseball cap emblazoned with the lightning bolt logo of his favorite band, AC/DC, at the scene of his attack on Maria Hernandez. Ramirez later left the print of his size 11.5 Avia sneakers in dirt, mud, blood, and on the face of victim Joyce Nelson. Most critically, he left behind 15 battered survivors who could provide an accurate physical description of the killer who made them, quote, swear to Satan. Initially, authorities believed that many of the killings were unrelated because of Ramirez's erratic, motiveless methods. Undaunted, lead detective Gil Carrillo was certain he was on the trail of a serial killer. Ramirez, however, kept an eye on the local media. With the heat on in LA, he headed for San Francisco. Bay Area police were temporarily hamstrung in their investigation when San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein leaked details about the crimes to the press, including the shoe print evidence. Ramirez disposed of his Avias and headed back to LA. When a single fingerprint from the rearview mirror of a stolen car used by the killer was matched to Ramirez, the police knew they had their man. When his mugshot was released to the press, the Night Stalker had no place to hide. Back in Los Angeles, after a failed trip to visit his brother in Tucson, Arizona, Richard Ramirez was unaware that he'd become the lead story on every newscast and newspaper in the city. While picking up a cup of coffee and pastry at a nearby liquor store, he noticed some elderly Hispanic women staring at him. He clearly heard one of them exclaim, "El Matador," the killer. Dropping his eyes to a newspaper rack, he saw his own face staring back at him. As he dashed for the exit, Ramirez formulated a plan. He'd steal a car, head for Mexico, and blend in. As Ramirez ran, he noticed a crowd was giving chase behind him. Desperate for escape, he attempted to carjack Manuela Villanueva while she waited for her boyfriend, Carmelo Robles, outside a bakery. Beaten away by Robles and barber Arthur Benavides, Ramirez fled on foot. Bounding over fences and running through backyards, he made 2 more attempts at carjacking. The second attempt would be his undoing. When Ramirez pulled Angie De La Torre from her automobile parked outside her home, he met his match in her husband, Manuel. Brandishing a heavy iron bar, Manuel struck Ramirez in the head. The killer wouldn't make it much further before the angry crowd descended on him, beating him with fists, feet, barbecue tools, and anything else they could get their hands on. Fortunately for Ramirez, the police arrived to take him into custody. Because of the sheer volume of crimes involved in the Night Stalker case, it took 2 years before Richard Ramirez could be brought before the court for a preliminary hearing on March 6, 1988. His inexperienced attorneys, Arturo and Daniel Hernandez, delayed the trial for years with requests for postponement and pretrial motions. Jury selection for what would be one of California's most expensive trials at last began in July 1988. During the delays, Ramirez consciously perfected his image as a bad boy outsider. He played the role of a rock star killer to the hilt, flashing satanic symbols, staring down the prosecution and jury, and praising Satan. When prosecutor Philip Halpin completed his methodical presentation of the gruesome evidence, the jury convicted Ramirez of 13 counts of murder. After being sentenced to die in California's gas chamber, Ramirez quipped,
"Big deal. That's always went with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland."
During and after Richard Ramirez's trial, the killer experienced a kind of adulation usually reserved for celebrities. The Night Stalker received thousands of letters from the curious and the lovelorn. Overwhelmingly, Ramirez's admirers were women, attracted by his boyish looks and fascinated by the brutality of his crimes. A dedicated group known as the Women in Black attended his hearings and visited the killer behind bars. One such groupie told San Francisco TV station KRON, "Everyone makes him look so bad. I know that he's a nice person because I've met him." Ramirez's most ardent admirer, journalist Doreen Leoy, received 75 love letters from the serial killer over a period of 11 years. In 1996, she and Ramirez married. According to some sources, Leoy cut off contact with Ramirez when DNA evidence linked him to the 1984 slaying of 9-year-old May Leung. As of January 2021, Leoy's whereabouts are unknown. On June 7, 2013, death claimed the Night Stalker. However, Richard Ramirez would not die in a California death chamber. Suffering from liver failure, Ramirez, who had become increasingly reclusive in his final years, was transported from San Quentin State Prison to Marin General Hospital. His deteriorating health manifested in his complexion, which reportedly took on a sickly green hue. As reported by USA Today, a report from the Marin County Coroner's Office revealed that Ramirez was suffering from B-cell lymphoma, a deadly form of blood cancer. His autopsy also stated that a history of drug use and hepatitis C infection also contributed to his death. Ramirez was 53 years old at the time of his passing. With appeals still pending, he likely wouldn't have faced execution until he was 71. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested at his Milwaukee apartment in 1991, and when the full extent of his crimes came to light, everyone was shocked, even the FBI. He remains one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history. This is the truth about Jeffrey Dahmer. At the heart of the horrors is, of course, Jeffrey Dahmer himself. When it came time for experts to determine if he was fit to stand trial, forensic psychiatrist Dr. George Palermo spent more than 12 hours interviewing him. Per the Chicago Tribune, he found Dahmer to be highly intelligent, emotionally tranquil, and his thinking processes were logical and rational. And somehow, that makes what they found in his apartment more terrifying. When the Associated Press picked up the story of Dahmer's arrest from the Milwaukee Sentinel in July 1991, they reported, police found 11 skulls scattered in a file cabinet, a closet, a refrigerator, and a freezer, and 3 headless torsos in a vat in the man's bedroom.
He said, we found 11 skulls. That was horrible.
For history, that vat was a 57-gallon drum filled with chemicals that were contributing to the slow decomposition of the bodies inside. There were 3 heads in the refrigerator, as well as evidence some of the victims had been cannibalized. When police began emptying the apartment, and as neighbors started to realize what was happening, the smells reportedly became clear. Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest wouldn't have happened if it weren't for a few Polaroid pictures carelessly left in plain sight. It wasn't until officers got a glimpse of those that they realized something was deeply wrong, as they doubted the man who fled to them for help. This was depicted in the 2002 movie Dahmer, in which Jeremy Renner played the infamous serial killer. As reported by Time, Jeffrey Dahmer spent 10 months in prison for fondling a 13-year-old boy in 1988 and offering him $50 to pose nude for pictures. After 10 months in jail, he regularly met with his probation officer, who in turn never checked Dahmer's home. That freedom, history says, coincided with the first of Dahmer's victims, who had vanished in March 1989. Just 2 months after that disappearance, Dahmer was before a judge, promising his child-molesting ways were behind him. Fast forward to July 22, 1992. That's when Tracy Edwards escaped from Dahmer's apartment. He later testified per the Los Angeles Times. He put his head on my chest, was listening to my heart, and said he was going to eat my heart. After watching The Exorcist 3, Edwards was able to hit and flee from a distracted Dahmer.
So as I was walking past the guy, I hit him, right?
Heading out into the city, Edwards found a police car and told officers what had happened, and showed them the handcuffs still around his wrist. When he took the doubting officers back to the apartment, Dahmer originally tried to explain the incident away as a domestic dispute, but that's when officers spotted the pictures. Dahmer was arrested without incident.
No one had a clue as to what was happening for over a decade.
A 2005 study published in the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology found childhood abuse, including physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, was present in the history of a high percentage of people who grew up to become serial killers. When it comes to Jeffrey Dahmer, his case is a little unique in that his father wrote a book about raising his son and the problems he saw from a young age. In interviews his parents gave after his arrest, they described Dahmer as a toddler, saying he was a happy young boy who loved animals and nature. But things started changing when Dahmer was just 4 years old and had surgery to repair a double hernia. Afterwards, he became convinced his genitals had been removed. His father has suggested that was connected to his later habit of castrating his victims. And he's also pointed the finger at other elements of his son's childhood that may have had some severely negative impacts on him. That includes being witness to the side effects his mother experienced after starting anti-anxiety medication, along with abandonment issues stemming from parents that largely left him, and later his little brother, to fend for themselves. Research done by Regis University suggests Jeffrey Dahmer's fascination with death started at about the same time as his hernia surgery, and an incident recounted by his father. Lionel Dahmer says 4-year-old Jeffrey was fascinated with a pile of bones under their home, and Jeffrey's interest in the dead and dying only increased. When Jeffrey Dahmer was in the 9th grade, he was given a biology assignment that involved dissecting a fetal pig. He not only happily completed the assignment, but kept the skeleton, which kicked off an obsession with collecting others. At first, those came from along the roadside, and Dahmer spent his formative years collecting dead animals and mutilating them further. The Miami Herald says Dahmer also killed the pets of his neighbors, mounting their heads on sticks. Today, animal cruelty is considered one of the warning signs a child might escalate in adulthood. The FBI started maintaining a database to track instances of animal cruelty in 2016, and stresses that instances of abuse need to be reported. John Backturf says he occasionally wondered what happened to his old school chum Jeffrey Dahmer, but it wasn't until 1991 headlines that he learned what his buddy had been up to. Backturf told The Independent, "There was always a darkness about him that was really kind of repellent. I was okay with hanging out with him if there was other people around. I was never going to be alone with him, and I'm pretty happy I had that instinct, because that could have well been me chopped up in the trunk of his car." Backturf was already an established artist when he decided to tell his story in the form of the graphic novel My Friend Dahmer. The 2012 work, which was turned into a movie, tried to shine some light on what it was like going to school with him. Dahmer, he says, started acting out in high school, when he would fake seizures and mock locals with disabilities. Backturf and his friends jokingly formed the Dahmer fan club.
The Jeff Dahmer fan club was a group of us who thought Jeff Dahmer was just a funny kid.
Backderf wrote, "All those things he perfected when he was very young through our goofball antics, he used them when he was a monster. That's a little hard to live with." Backderf also wondered where all the adults were at the time. He explained, "They didn't care. They just figured, well, next year he'll be somebody else's problem." And of course, he was somebody else's problem. Jeffrey Dahmer's parents finalized their divorce on July 24, 1978. About a month prior to that, he killed his first victim. Stephen Hicks had been hitchhiking to a concert, and when he didn't come home, his parents didn't think anything of it. They reported him missing 6 days later, but he was already dead. It wasn't until 1991 that law enforcement connected Hicks's disappearance with Dahmer, and it was also then they started taking a close look at Dahmer's 1978 home in Ohio. The New York Times reported, "After hours of combing through woods and underbrush, local officials today found more than 50 bone fragments, a substantial quantity of blood, and a bloody handprint in the crawl space. That would quickly escalate to 500 bone fragments, and Dahmer would eventually confess to picking up Hicks, inviting him home for a drink, and smashing him first with a barbell, then destroying his remains with a sledgehammer. And he was nearly caught. Dahmer was pulled over by police when he was disposing of Hicks's body, and officers asked him why he had plastic bags in his car. He convinced them he was just getting some air, and, distraught over his parents' impending divorce, he was taking the garbage to the dump while he was out. Officers let him go. Jeffrey Dahmer enlisted in the military and was sent to Germany in 1979, where he was attached to a medic unit. One of the other men in the unit, Preston Davis, says he was drugged then sexually assaulted by Dahmer, telling The Independent in 2013, "I'm just thankful to be alive to tell the story." After Davis left, he was replaced by a soldier named Billy Joe Capshaw. After being sexually assaulted multiple times, Capshaw jumped from a third-story window, survived, and reported the assaults. Superior officers returned him to the barracks where the abuse continued, and after he left the military, he spent 5 years locked in his own room. After years of therapy and a friendship with Dahmer's other victim, he was finally able to talk about what happened. Conorak Synthensymphoam was among the 11 victims whose remains were discovered at Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. And his story starts years prior. The 13-year-old boy Dahmer had been convicted of molesting in 1988 was Conorak's older brother. The family was told Dahmer had been incarcerated for his crimes, but in 1991, he lured Conorak to his apartment with promises he'd pay him for posing for a few photos. Dahmer drugged him, drilled a hole in his skull, and injected him with hydrochloric acid. He was still unconscious when Dahmer left for the store, and Dahmer was still gone when he woke. Conorak was running down the street when he came across Nicole Childress and Sandra Smith. They called police, but by that time, Dahmer was on the street again to reclaim his victim. Dahmer claimed the boy was his house guest and was ultimately released by police, who escorted them both back to Dahmer's apartment, then threatened to arrest Smith for her continued insistence that something was deeply wrong. Conorak was dead half an hour later. In spite of the fact that Dahmer already had another body in his apartment, the officers testified, per the New York Times, that they believed the two had, quote, a caring relationship. Officer Joseph Gabrish said, "We're trained to be observant. I've been doing this for a while, and usually if something stands out, you'll spot it. There just wasn't anything there." Jeffrey Dahmer's parents have spoken out about their son, and his father, Lionel, even wrote a book, A Father's Story, in an attempt to make sense out of what had happened. Discussing the book, Oxygen reported, "The dad often blamed himself for Jeffrey's severe flaws. Lionel said he was negligent and probably didn't give enough to Jeffrey emotionally." Jeffrey's mother, Joyce Flint, told the Seattle Times in 1993, "I wake up every morning and for a split second, I don't know I'm Jeffrey Dahmer's mother, and then it all floods in." She later told Hard Copy, "I still love my son. I've never stopped loving my son." Flint died of breast cancer in 2000, having spent much of her life working as a case manager for the Central Valley AIDS team. She also founded an HIV community center called The Living Room. After Jeffrey Dahmer's confession and conviction came jail, and while he was there, he started receiving a ton of fan mail. In 1994, the Associated Press reported that Dahmer had already received a shocking $12,000 in letters that were sent to him from across the globe. Some sent him money to spend on creature comforts, while others sent donations as gifts, with at least one woman hoping that the $350 she sent him would encourage him to learn about Christ. The New Statesman took a look at some of the so-called serial killer fandoms and found a secret Facebook group filled with Dahmer fans. The publication spoke with one member who revealed that she felt connected to Dahmer and explained, "It's not that I agreed with what he did, but I understood the triggers. Society has a lot to answer for in terms of how people turn out." Jeffrey Dahmer was ultimately sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms, and at first he spent some time in protective custody. After a year in jail, he asked to be returned to a more communal area, and he started to spend time, sometimes unsupervised, with other prisoners. That's where things went sideways. There was an attempt on his life in 1994 at a chapel service the newly baptized Dahmer was attending. Then, on November 28, 1994, Dahmer was bludgeoned to death by another inmate named Christopher Scarver. Scarver later talked to the New York Post and explained why he'd done it, saying, "He crossed the line with some people, prisoners, prison staff. Some people who are in prison are repentant, but he was not one of them."
What could one of the most famous adult industry stars of the 1970s have in common with one of the most infamous murder scenes in the history of Los Angeles? More than you think, it turns out. Let's take a closer look at the gruesome history of the Wonderland murders. To fully understand what events led to the Wonderland murders, you need to look into the life and times of the notorious John Holmes. As the New York Times puts it, Holmes was a very popular and prolific adult movie performer who became famous for his many escapades in the nascent industry in the 1970s. Though he died in 1988 at just 43 years old, his IMDb page reveals that he had no less than 231 credits as an actor, the vast majority of which were porn. As Salon tells us, however, Holmes's life wasn't all roses and disrobement. Over his years of increasing fame, he developed a massive cocaine addiction, which took a toll on his professional life. His habit, which allegedly cost him as much as $1,500 per day, also started costing him job opportunities, and the producers who had been lining up to cast him eventually turned their back on him. Holmes knew why this was, too. In the middle of a scene, I would disappear for long stretches, but my co-workers knew where to find me, in the bathroom doing freebase. I became the butt of jokes, which traveled around like wildfire. To get Holmes to work, they said, you have to leave a trail of freebase from the bathroom to the bedroom. This behavior led to a huge decrease in his income, which caused him to turn to small-time crime and some very questionable company. A key person when it comes to the Wonderland murders is nightclub owner Eddie Nash. According to Salon, Nash was the kind of guy who had $1 million in cocaine stashed in his house, which he eventually went to prison for. However, that's far from the only thing authorities have suspected him of over the years. As the Los Angeles Times tells us, Nash was a fearsome nightlife magnate. And John Holmes once called him, quote, the most evil man I've ever known. However, it's worth noting that there was a time when the men's relationship was, at least on the surface, far warmer than that chilly comment implies. Per LA Weekly, Nash turned a measly hot dog stand into a massive nightclub empire that included as many as 36 locations, including hot clubs like the Paradise Ballroom. Nash was also said to be heavily involved in the drug trade that flourished in these establishments. All in all, the stories make Nash seem like the kind of guy you definitely didn't want to cross, especially if you were far more small-time than him. Unfortunately, that's exactly what the Wonderland gang did. As a surviving member of the group, David Lind put it, the certain type of dope dealer you didn't rob was Mr. Nash. It was obvious from the time we got in the house that we were over our heads. The exact circumstances of the first meeting between John Holmes and Eddie Nash are unclear, but as LA Weekly tells us, the two soon became close enough that Nash was known to refer to Holmes as his brother. According to Salon, the pair may simply have been impressed with each other's respective lines of work and the similar reputation they shared. Bill Margold, who knew them both, said there was an interest on Holmes's part toward Nash for the drug culture and an interest from Nash toward Holmes for the adult entertainment fast lane lifestyle. Nash was about as mysterious as Holmes, and I think that mutual mystery attracted them to each other. Regardless of how the pair originally became close, Holmes was clearly aware of how dangerous Nash was, and even warned a female acquaintance, Dawn Schiller, that the nightclub owner could make people disappear. The relationship between the magnate and the porn star was also pretty clearly skewed in the former's favor, thanks to Nash's power and access to drugs and Holmes's relative destitution and drug addiction. As a result, Holmes did some pretty unsavory things to keep in Nash's good graces. The Wonderland murders have many names, but arguably the catchiest one is based on the victims of the crime, the so-called Wonderland Gang. According to Salon, they were a loose collective of drug dealers, evidently named after their base of operations on 8763 Wonderland Avenue. John Holmes reportedly fell in with the Wonderland Gang because of his own drug habit. They were almost certainly not his first choice of company, seeing as the Globe and Mail tells us that the gang was extremely small-time. However, beggars can't be choosers. Holmes was in serious debt, and pretty much no one would sell him drugs anymore, so he had to work in whatever circles he still had access to. As the Los Angeles Times tells us, at least one witness in the court proceedings around the Wonderland murders later said that the gang was affiliated with Eddie Nash through Holmes. As the waning adult industry superstar was on good terms with Nash, he became a courier of sorts between the parties. The Wonderland gang stole stuff, and Holmes took it to Nash's place and traded the haul for drugs. If things would have stayed that way, the story might have ended very differently. Unfortunately, on June 29, 1981, things took a turn for the worse. According to UPI, the road to the Wonderland murders was paved with bad intentions. John Holmes was involved with both the small-time Wonderland gang and the considerably wealthier Eddie Nash, and as prosecutor Ron Cohen put it, the adult entertainment star eventually noted, quote, Eddie Nash was ripe for robbery. Though Holmes presumably didn't take part in the actual robbery, he was allegedly instrumental in the plot and purposefully left a door at Nash's house open in order to allow the Wonderland gang to enter. The gang's haul consisted of drugs, jewelry, and cash, and its value ranges from Cohen's estimate of $10,000 to the $1 million reported by LA Weekly. However, possibly the thing that sealed the gang's fate was the sheer humiliation they caused Nash. The robbers surprised the nightclub owner and his bodyguard, who received a minor gunshot wound in the process. Reportedly, Nash was terrified and certain that he died. Prosecutor Cohen later described the situation. Eddie Nash fell to his knees. He humiliated himself by asking permission to say his prayers. From the robbery on to the actual murders, the law has never officially been able to make sense of things. However, as the story goes, the Wonderland gang's robbery went well and Holmes had his share of the haul. But as Salon tells us, the group's luck was about to turn. Nash soon figured out who robbed him, and it didn't take long to find out that Holmes had been the thieves' inside man. As LA Weekly notes, Holmes had connections and debts to both Nash and the Wonderland crew, and was the only individual connecting both parties. Per UPI, the authorities certainly thought that Nash subsequently forced Holmes to set up the murders as revenge, and there is some evidence that the porn star himself was present at the scene when the crime took place. As the Los Angeles Times tells us, on July 1st, 1981, the killer or killers stepped into the Wonderland gang's den without any sign of breaking and entering. The events that followed occurred just 40 hours after Nash was robbed, and they were hardly muted. One neighbor woke to the screams of a man who was begging for his life. 4 people died in the attack: William Deverell, Ronald Lanius, Joy Miller, and Barbara Richardson. There was also one survivor, Susan Lanius, whose moans alerted a passerby a few hours after the incident. However, the injuries she suffered in the incident caused lasting brain damage. The police were quick to connect John Holmes to the gruesome murder scene. This was presumably aided by the fact that, according to UPI, they discovered his palm prints near one of the victims, which was a pretty clear insinuation that he had been present at the scene. According to LA Weekly, the police were just one of Holmes's problems at this point. He had a history as a police informant during his days as a porn star, happily snitching on industry people he didn't get along with to a Vice Squad connection. It is possible that the combination of this reputation and the mess he found himself in caused a surprising amount of people to go after his head. Holmes's girlfriend, Dawn Schiller, said, "We were told that Eddie's was only one of the contracts out on John. There were all these mysterious other people John was about to rat on. People were afraid he was going to inform." The Wonderland murders remain unsolved to this day, though as Salon points out, it's not because people don't know who did them, it's just because there's been no official conviction. In fact, as the Los Angeles Times tells us, the police have considered the case essentially solved for quite a while, even though it never closed in court. Lead investigator Detective Tom Lang stated in 1988, "There is no mystery because we know who is involved and we know why, but we have a certain set of rules to follow that the people who go out and perpetrate crimes don't." Per LA Weekly, John Holmes was the first to stand trial in 1981. but he was acquitted in 1982. The only jail time he received for the case were the 111 days for contempt of court, because he refused to answer the grand jury's questions until Eddie Nash was locked up for an unrelated narcotics charge. As for Nash, he went to court for the murders in 1990, but a single dissenting juror caused a hung jury and a mistrial. A second attempt in 1991 acquitted him entirely. According to LAPD Online, he didn't get away entirely scot-free. In 2001, Nash pled guilty to a number of racketeering charges that effectively proved that he was involved in planning the murders and threatened and bribed witnesses and a juror. For this, he served a whopping 1 year in prison. Though John Holmes was acquitted of the Wonderland murders himself, his connection to them has long been fairly clear. According to Los Angeles Times, the authorities believe he was an active party, and the porn star himself told a biographer that he was forced to witness the murders while one of the culprits was threatening him with a gun. Arguably, the most interesting version of the story comes from John Holmes' wife, Sharon, who says that the broken man told her the real story a few weeks after the incident. According to her, her crying husband revealed that the actual crime was committed by 3 thugs, and he was forced to lead them to the site and stand by as the events transpired. While John didn't actually reveal the names of the culprits, he said that he knew them. Some have called Sharon Holmes' account into question and noted that John was such a notorious liar that he simply couldn't be trusted. However, if true, this alleged confession offers a lot of insight into the terrifying events. As a high-profile bloody murder case right at the edge of Tinseltown, it's no surprise that the Wonderland murders have made their mark on pop culture, especially because the case involved a celebrity of sorts. A 2003 crime drama based on the events was even made, titled Wonderland, clips of which you have seen scattered throughout this video. It has some considerable star power behind it, with Val Kilmer as John Holmes, Kate Bosworth as Don Schiller, and Dylan McDermott as surviving Wonderland gang member David Lynn. Character actor Eric Bogosian takes on the role of the ruthless Eddie Nash. However, you might be more familiar with the fictionalized version of the story. Paul Thomas Anderson's 1997 drama Boogie Nights tells the story of a Holmes-esque character called Dirk Diggler, whose downfall involves a creepy encounter with a shady drug dealer called Rahad Jackson. Per Salon, Jackson's character was heavily influenced by Nash, even though the story plays out slightly differently and the entire situation is resolved at the robbery stage. Anderson has actually stated that a Rolling Stone article about Holmes and the Wonderland murders was a major influence on this particular plot point. Anderson said, "There was this great Rolling Stone article, and I remember the description of this guy Eddie Nash in Speedos and the sheen of sweat on his body."
Perhaps the most infamous hotel in the United States, the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles has a long and sordid past, catering to those seeking the seedier side of life. Its history has been a grim assortment of misfortunes and sad occurrences that have continued until fairly recently. The first recorded suicide at the Cecil happened at a time when the Great Depression was truly ramping up and was perhaps an ominous portent for things to come over the following decades, as there would continue to be such deaths from that point on.
Every hotel has suicides, every hotel maybe would have a murder or two, not like this.
On November 19, 1931, a Manhattan Beach resident, one W.K. Norton, was found by hotel staff in his hotel room, deceased. According to KCET, he had only been dead for a few hours by the time he was found. In the subsequent investigation, police found capsules that were believed to be filled with poison in Norton's vest pocket. Norton's death may not have been the first glimpse at what was to come at the Cecil. Also, according to KCET, a woman named Dorothy Robertson was taken to the hospital after wandering around the hotel for 3 days, having consumed barbiturates in an attempt to kill herself following the death of her husband. Another death that occurred at the Cecil happened in March 1937, and to this day, authorities don't know if it was intentional or an accident. In this case, 25-year-old Grace E. Magro either fell or jumped from a 9th-story window and wound up getting caught up in telephone wires on the way down. According to the Los Angeles Times, her companion was asleep in the room at the time of the incident and therefore gave no information as to how Magro ended up falling from the window. Magro was transported to the Georgia Street Receiving Hospital, where she died soon after. She is the first of many people, if she did indeed choose, to end her own life by jumping from the higher stories of the Cecil Hotel.
Is there a room here that maybe somebody hasn't died in?
In September 1944, 19-year-old Dorothy Jean Purcell had been staying in the Cecil for a couple of days with 38-year-old Ben Levine, when she awoke in the early morning hours to the feeling that she was about to give birth. According to the Los Angeles Times, Purcell then went to the restroom on her floor and delivered the baby alone, not wanting to disturb Levine. Believing the baby to be stillborn, Purcell then threw it out a nearby window. The baby landed on the roof of a nearby building, and Purcell went back to her room, deciding to refrain from telling Levine what had happened. Purcell was arrested shortly after the event took place. Purcell was brought to trial for the possible homicide. During the trial, it was revealed by the autopsy surgeon that the baby boy had, in fact, been alive when born. The proof, the examiner explained, was evidence of oxygen in the lungs. Purcell was also examined by psychologists and eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity.
They rented a room, went up to the room, and then jumped out the window.
Another person who is known to have jumped to her death from the Cecil Hotel is 27-year-old Pauline Otten, who did so in October 1962. Otten, though, did not simply kill herself after jumping. According to Film Daily, Otten leapt from the window of her 9th-story room following an argument with her estranged husband. Unfortunately, when she fell, she landed on a 68-year-old transient man named George Gialini, who just happened to be walking by at the time. By the time police arrived, both Otten and Gialini were dead, having been killed instantly upon impact. When beginning their investigation, there were no witnesses to the events, which complicated things. Initially, police thought that the two had potentially leapt together from the hotel. The truth became clear, however, when police discovered his hands in his pockets and his shoes still on, something that would not have been possible had he also jumped from the hotel. Some of the deaths that have occurred at the Cecil have remained unsolved to this day, and the case of Pigeon Goldie Osgood is one of them. She was a retired telephone operator who earned her nickname because she was known to frequently feed the pigeons in Pershing Square. A woman whose most dangerous act, according to the Los Angeles Times, was to scare away bigger birds from the smaller ones she was feeding, was found dead in her Cecil hotel room in 1964, having been shot, stabbed, and sexually assaulted. The hotel staffer who found her body also found her Dodgers baseball cap and bags of feed next to the body. Police suspected that Osgood's death was connected to another that occurred the previous month at a nearby hotel. A 29-year-old laborer, Jacques Ellinger, was arrested by police after being seen in Pershing Square covered with blood shortly after the murder took place. Ellinger had admitted to knowing Osgood but denied having anything to do with her death. Police never found enough evidence to charge Ellinger or anyone else, and the crime sadly remains unsolved. Perhaps the most famous person on this list, the Satan-worshipping serial killer Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, is said to have spent some time living at the Cecil in the mid-1980s, during which he engaged in a crime spree that devastated Los Angeles. According to biography, Ramirez was known to have killed at least 14 people and sexually assaulted and tortured at least 20 more between June 1984 and August 1985.
I'm afraid for everybody, elderly, young, everybody.
From childhood through his teen years, Ramirez's criminal behavior exponentially increased, starting with a 1977 arrest for marijuana. His first murder occurred 7 years later, in 1984, when he killed 9-year-old May Linda Lung in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. This crime wasn't connected to Ramirez until new DNA technology was used, over 20 years later. Ramirez's first Night Stalker killing occurred on June 28, 1984, when he assaulted, then stabbed to death 79-year-old Jenny Venkow. From that point, he spent over a year terrorizing Los Angeles before being caught and arrested in August 1985, when he attempted to steal a car. Area residents chased Ramirez and proceeded to beat him until the police arrived. The Cecil has not had one infamous serial killer, it's had two. Austrian Johann Jack Unterweger also spent time at the hotel. By the time he stayed at the Cecil, though, Unterweger had already been convicted of and released from prison for murder. In 1974, Unterweger killed 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer and was given a life sentence for it. According to biography, he began to write prodigiously in prison and accrue a following for his work. Less than a decade after being sentenced, a petition was started for his release, which happened in 1990 after he served the minimum 15 years required by Austrian law. Upon release, Unterweger took the lives of at least 7 more people before being hired by a magazine to write about crime in Los Angeles. In the time he was there, he stayed some of the time at the Cecil Hotel. Also in that time, 3 sex workers were found killed in much the same way Unterweger's European victims had been. Unterweger came under suspicion for the deaths, and when police finally had enough evidence, he had fled. Unterweger was eventually captured in Miami and extradited back to Austria. On the day he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, he took his own life in his jail cell. Some crimes have occurred not quite within the walls of the Cecil Hotel, but they are tangentially related. Take the death of 32-year-old Terry Francis Craig, for example. The Los Angeles Times writes that in 1988, Craig had been found brutally stabbed to death in the rented Huntington Beach home she had shared with her boyfriend, Robert Sullivan. According to witnesses, Sullivan had been seen driving away from the property the day of the killing. And where did he go? When police found him almost 2 months later, Sullivan was holed up at the Cecil Hotel. One of the most recent tragedies to strike on the grounds of the Cecil Hotel is that of 21-year-old Canadian student Elisa Lam, who was found in a water supply tank on top of the hotel on February 19, 2013. According to CNN, after complaints from residents about the pressure and taste of the water, a maintenance worker found her body. Lam's story is a tragic one. She checked into the hotel on January 26th, and the last known footage of her was taken 5 days later. In the video, Lam can be seen entering and leaving an elevator, pressing the buttons multiple times, and possibly gesturing and talking to someone off-screen, who she may or may not have been hiding from. This footage was not the only cause for consternation and confusion by police and armchair detectives alike, though. The physical location of Lam's body also created issues in explaining her death. She was found inside one of the 4 8-foot-tall water cisterns on the hotel roof. Not only that, her possessions and clothing were found inside the tank with her, though she was undressed. Theories range when it comes to explaining Lam's disappearance and death. While the paranormal and the hotel's history have been invoked, CNN reports that her death was ruled an accident.
The explanation is that, she was having some behavioral difficulties and maybe didn't know exactly what she was doing.
USA Today adds that bipolar disorder, which Lam was on medication for, was a significant factor in the death. This explanation, though, sadly does not fully explain just how Lam ended up in the water tank. One of the more popular horror television series of the last decade, Ryan Murphy and Brad Falchuk's anthology series American Horror Story used the Cecil Hotel as part of the inspiration for its 5th season, aptly named Hotel. Set at the Hotel Cortez in Los Angeles, the season dives into the hotel's mysterious past and the guests that have, for various reasons, never checked out. While there are some people that are still actually alive inside, the majority of the characters viewers were introduced to had already met their end. This is put on full display in the episode Devil's Night, when Mr. March hosts a dinner for a veritable who's who of American serial killers, including John Wayne Gacy, Eileen Wuornos, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Zodiac Killer, and the Cecil's own former resident, Richard Ramirez.
I don't get you, man. The real fun starts after you get caught. Don't you know that? And giving yourself your own nickname? Not cool, dude.
The Cecil Hotel wasn't the only inspiration for the season, though. According to Screen Rant, there was another infamous hotel used, built in the late 1800s to accommodate visitors to the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, or World's Fair. H.H. Holmes' Murder Castle and Holmes himself were integral references for many of the plot points of the season. While March is not a direct adaptation of Holmes, the similarities are there. While the Cecil Hotel may seem like the kind of place that should have been shuttered long, long ago, it is in fact still open. In 2007, new owners started renovating and refurbishing the hotel, working to turn it from single-resident occupancy housing into something closer to a hostel-like boutique hotel experience. A few short years after that, in 2011, the Cecil Hotel got another upgrade, a new name. In 2011, the Cecil Hotel became the Stay on Main, a few years after a portion of the hotel was refurbished by a new owner. Then, in 2014, the hotel was again sold to Richard Bourne, a New York-based hotelier. Then, in 2015, Simon Barron Development entered a 99-year ground lease with the property owner, according to Curbed Los Angeles. At that time, plans for renovation included rehabbing 261 of the 301 residency units and building 30 additional in a different spot owned by the company. Then, in 2017, it was designated a Los Angeles Historic Landmark. In 1980, an axe murder on Friday the 13th rattled a small, sleepy town in Texas. The victim was struck 41 times. The killer's identity shocked the community. No one expected her to get away with it, but she did. This is the true story behind the murder of Betty Gore. On June 13, 1980, bubbly churchgoer Candy Montgomery killed best friend and schoolteacher Betty Gore. The story was sensational and captured the attention of Wiley, Texas, partially because it began with the soapy love affair between Montgomery and Gore's husband. The two began a liaison that lasted nearly a year. Just as they thought they had gotten away with it, their transgressions caught up to them and eventually resulted in a murder trial. According to Texas Monthly, the Montgomerys and the Gores were so close that on the day Candy Montgomery killed Betty Gore, their kids spent the day together, chauffeured around town by Montgomery herself. Even in the thick of Montgomery's affair with Alan Gore, she continued her friendship with Betty. She threw a surprise baby shower for the pregnant Gore during a church choir dinner a month before her due date. The two were devoted members of the Methodist Church of Lucas's choir, and because their lives revolved around church, they had an easy bond. But friendship ultimately turned to hatred. Montgomery claimed that Gore came after Montgomery with an axe after her affair with Alan was discovered. Even when Gore had slipped and lay helpless, her head bleeding from a hit Montgomery gave her early on, Montgomery kept attacking her. According to the Dallas Morning News, most of the hits came when Gore was already unconscious. Candy Montgomery and Alan Gore approached their affair in such a perfectly planned way that it made their unconventional relationship even more offbeat. They had only known each other for 9 months when they met at their church volleyball court. She decided to pursue a covert affair with him, patiently waiting for him to come around to the idea. Gore was surprised and flattered by the attention he received from her and agreed to the affair. Before they had actually begun an affair, Montgomery set up a pros and cons list. Afterwards, they set up rules to abide by, which included avoid becoming too emotionally invested, meet only on weekdays at Como Motel, divide all expenses equally. Montgomery would be responsible for lunch, and if it became too risky, the affair would have to end. Their affair lasted nearly a year and ended soon after Gore's second child was born.
If either of us start to develop feelings for the other, it's over. But right then and there, I mean, that's how you get caught.
Betty Gore, born Betty Pomeroy, was a likable and popular girl from the small town of Norwich, Kansas. Alan Gore was her math teacher in college. He was shy and plain-looking, and their decision to marry was met with some raised eyebrows. Betty's personality seemed to change during married life. She became emotionally dependent on Gore, whose job at Rockwell International required him to travel. Betty became an unhappy schoolteacher who regimented her and Alan's sex life in order to plan her next pregnancy. Alan became unhappy as a result. Betty's fear of abandonment grew stronger, and she resented her husband's traveling and business trips that came with a new job. It's also possible she was suffering from postpartum depression. Around the same time, Candy Montgomery's and Alan's affair deteriorated after Betty gave birth to their daughter, Bethany. Betty and Alan started attending a marriage counseling program called Methodist Marriage Encounter. It was an intense weekend getaway program where couples were expected to bond far away from distractions like television or routine life. Here, Alan admitted that he no longer felt close to Betty and hoped to patch up their marriage. Betty shared her personal shortcomings and some ominous feelings. Although she never feared for her own safety with Alan around, she reportedly hated being alone. Candy Montgomery, born Candy Wheeler, was an Army brat as a child. Her family was constantly moving, which probably affected Montgomery's later boredom in her stable marriage to Pat Montgomery. She was confident and upfront and was responsible for initiating the affair with Alan Gore. Her marriage had grown stale, and she sought something exciting. She's said to have been considered the most attractive woman at their church. Like Alan Gore, she loved kids and was always involved in the community. And when news of Montgomery's grisly murder spread throughout town, a friend of hers told the Dallas Times-Herald that Montgomery didn't have it in her to commit such a crime. She was so well-liked that after she had been released on bail, she and her family received numerous messages of support from their friends and the church. Montgomery took the time to respond to Hallmark cards from people she hadn't seen in years. During her brawl with Betty Gore, in which they both tried to gain control of the axe, Candy Montgomery had nearly escaped the room. She had hit Gore in the head, drawing blood, and found an opportunity to bolt for an exit. But Gore didn't let her go, according to Montgomery's testimony in court. During the struggle, Montgomery said she switched to attack mode, grabbed the axe from Gore's hands, and rained 41 blows on her. 28 of the swings came down on Gore's head. In court, Montgomery cried while retelling the incident and didn't deny killing her former friend. She shrieked in agony when presented with the axe in court and begged not to be forced to look at it. Lester Gaylor, the Gore's next-door neighbor who went to check in on Betty at Alan Gore's request, said the crime scene was the worst he'd ever seen.
I've seen a lot of people dying in a lot of different ways, but that's the worst I ever seen.
He recalled seeing blood everywhere and axe marks as high as the ceiling. He remembered seeing Montgomery the next day and said she acted normally, as if she had not been involved. After Candy Montgomery killed Betty Gore, she went about her day as usual. She even cleaned herself at Gore's house before she left, leaving the Gore's 1-year-old baby alone crying in her crib, according to the Dallas Morning News. She went home to change her clothes and bandage a cut she received on her foot during her fight with Gore. She then picked up her kids, along with the Gore's daughter, Elisa, from church. She told a friend that she had seen Gore earlier in the day and spent so much time chatting that it left her no time for other errands. Later that afternoon, Montgomery took her kids and Elisa to the movies and watched The Empire Strikes Back. That night, Elisa slept over. Montgomery even lied on the phone with Gore's husband, Alan. Alan was concerned since Betty was not answering her phone all day, and even in Candy's version of events, she knew exactly why Betty wasn't picking up the phone. To convince the jury that Candy Montgomery acted in self-defense, Montgomery's lawyers painted a picture of a confrontational and vengeful Betty Gore. Gore had just put her baby to sleep when Montgomery arrived at her house. Montgomery intended to ask Gore about taking her daughter Elisa to her swim class, since Elisa wanted to join the Montgomerys for their trip to the movies. But Gore invited Montgomery into her living room, where she confronted Montgomery about her affair with her husband, Alan. Montgomery admitted to it, and Gore excused herself from the room and returned with an axe. They argued for a few minutes, and Montgomery apologized. Her expression of remorse may have set off Gore, because she then pushed Montgomery into the utility room of her home. She held her axe threateningly in the air, warning Montgomery to stay away from her husband. Montgomery assured her she didn't want to be with Alan, but Gore was determined to kill Montgomery. She hit Gore on the head once, and the two women began to jostle for control of the axe. Since Candy Montgomery admitted that she was the last to see Betty Gore alive, and because Alan Gore disclosed their affair to investigators, Montgomery became the top suspect. It didn't take long for her to be charged with murder. The fact that she had an affair with Betty's husband was considered as a compelling motive, and she was arrested on June 27, 1980. But Montgomery denied all charges. Her lawyer enlisted the help of a psychiatrist and a clinical hypnotist to probe into her version of the incident. The session must have been intense because a witness who was sitting in the waiting room recalled hearing several shrieks from the doctor's office. Dr. Fred Faison conducted 3 strenuous hypnosis sessions, from which they pieced together a narrative about what happened at Gore's home. Her non-hypnosis account sometimes clashed with her hypnosis account, after which her lawyer, Don Crowder, worked to straighten out the facts. What amounted from her hypnosis was a confession, which led to her self-defense plea. What emerged from Candy Montgomery's hypnosis was a tale of childhood trauma. She recalled a moment from when she was 4 years old that would end up affecting her for the rest of her life. After losing in a race to another child, Montgomery threw a jar in anger. Her mother responded to her emotions by shushing her. According to Montgomery's court defense, just as Gore was losing her fight against Montgomery, she had already been struck in the head by Montgomery. She regained control of the axe, put one finger to her lips, and shushed her, flooding her with memories from the childhood incident. That noise dredged up the childhood trauma. In one moment, Montgomery took back the axe and made the fatal blows against Gore's body. Montgomery was thereafter motivated by hate and her own indignation against Betty's attempted revenge. The justification served a purpose. Self-defense can be accounted for with a few hits, but how do you explain a total of 41 axe blows to the jury? Candy Montgomery's self-defense and childhood trauma explanation was sufficient for the jury. She was found not guilty. The deliberation took less than 4 hours. Montgomery was reported as having no emotion when her verdict was read. Montgomery had struck a woman 41 times and had gotten off scot-free, shocking her community. As Montgomery rushed to her attorney's car after the trial, she was surrounded by angry people and subjected to chants of murderer.
Well, I've been here for almost the whole trial, and I can't believe it. Everybody's in shock.
Soon after her acquittal, Candy Montgomery told reporters that she wanted to move on and return to her usual life. She did as much of that as she could. Her family moved to Georgia, and she later got divorced, allegedly reverting her last name back to her maiden name, Wheeler. According to the Dallas Morning News, she became a certified family counselor. But despite her efforts to fade into obscurity, a past like Montgomery's is virtually inescapable. According to Collin County's local profile, Montgomery's counseling practice gets bad reviews online, with people decrying her as a bad person. 20 years after the incident, the Dallas Morning News reached out to Montgomery for comments, but she rebuffed them, saying, "I'm telling you in big, bold letters, I'm not interested." Initially, there were mixed feelings about Montgomery's freedom. Betty Gore's father, Bob Pomeroy, wasn't pleased with the verdict, but knew Montgomery would have to live with her actions. Gore's next-door neighbor, Lester Gaylor, who still lives in the same home that he did at the time, told CBS News that he believes justice wasn't served and that Montgomery killed Gore because her affair was discovered. Alan Gore remarried shortly after the trial, but that eventually ended in divorce. He also lost custody of his 2 daughters, who were reportedly raised by Betty Gore's parents. Several years after the trial, Candy Montgomery's attorney, Don Crowder, said that the faces of Gore's family still haunted him. He was afraid that they didn't comprehend his job in defending their daughter's killer. He also had mixed feelings about the legacy of that case on his career, saying, "That case was maybe the zenith of an extraordinarily successful career, or the demise of what could have been." Crowder committed suicide in 1998, seemingly motivated by other perceived failures in his life and career. The killing also affected the small town of Wiley, Texas. Not much happened usually in Wiley, so when a school teacher was murdered with an axe, fear overtook the town, and stores began to close down early. The paranoid atmosphere continued even after Montgomery's arrest. Fire Marshal Steve Deffenbaugh, who had been at the crime scene, told the Dallas Morning News that he still thinks about the killing every June 13th.
As tragic as the murders of Sharon Tate and her friends were, they have come to overshadow the Manson family's next night of terror. It was the murder of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca that plunged Los Angeles into fear and paranoia. This is the messed up truth of the LaBianca murders. As documented by Linda Kasabian's testimony, Charles Manson called her, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten to the bunkhouse at the family's hideaway at the Spahn Ranch after dinner on the evening of Saturday, August 9, 1969. Noting that Manson instructed the young women to bring along a change of clothing, Kasabian, who had been the lookout for the Tate killings, became uneasy knowing that she would again be sent on a murderous mission. Manson told them, "Last night was too messy. This time I'm going to show you how to do it." With Manson at the wheel, the participants in the Cielo Drive massacre, Charles Tex Watson, Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Kasabian, along with Van Houten and Steve Clem Grogan, headed out in search of their next victims. After several false starts, the family at last wound up at a house in Los Feliz. Armed with a pistol, Manson exited the car and made his way up the home's long driveway alone. One of the Manson family's favorite pastimes was an activity they called creepy crawling. Family members would enter a home under the cover of night and silently creep and crawl from room to room, rearranging the sleeping occupants' possessions. During Manson's trial, Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi surmised that the creepy crawls were merely dress rehearsals for murder. In the early morning hours of Sunday, August 10, 1969, Manson slipped into the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca to survey the scene. According to Charles Tex Watson's memoir, Will You Die For Me?, Manson returned to the car moments later and summoned Watson to come with him. Rousing Leno LaBianca from his sleep, Manson held a gun on the grocery store president, assuring him that he wasn't going to be harmed. Manson stated he was after money and nothing else. Watson bound LaBianca's hands behind his back while Manson went to the bedroom to retrieve Rosemary. Further assuring the frightened couple that they wouldn't be hurt, Manson left the house with Rosemary LaBianca's wallet. Moments later, Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten entered the LaBianca home with orders to kill. As Manson's followers were left to their bloody work, Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Steve Clem Grogan left the scene. According to Bugliosi's book Helter Skelter, Manson gave Kasabian Rosemary LaBianca's wallet and instructed her to wipe off any incriminating fingerprints and remove the change. LaBianca's driver's license and, most importantly, her credit cards were to remain untouched. Manson explained that he was going to drive to a predominantly black neighborhood where Kasabian was to toss the wallet on the sidewalk. Explaining that a person of color would find the wallet and use the credit cards, Manson hoped that the press and the authorities would blame the murders on the Black Panthers. With the blame deflected from the family and placed on the black political organization, Manson believed that the country would edge nearer to helter-skelter, an apocalyptic race war from which Manson and his followers would emerge as victors. Inexplicably, Manson changed his mind at the last minute and instead drove to a nearby gas station, where he instructed Kasabian to leave the wallet in the women's restroom. Kasabian, now fearful after 2 nights of murder, instead hid LaBianca's wallet inside a toilet tank rather than leaving it where it could be easily found. A key piece of evidence, the wallet was finally discovered 4 months after the August 10 killings. According to the Los Angeles Deputy DA Vincent Bugliosi, investigators were initially reluctant to link the LaBianca and Tate murders. At the time, the police regarded the LaBianca killings as a copycat crime. Regardless of the official position of the authorities, the general public could easily see the parallels in the crimes. Gripped by fear, Los Angeles held its breath, waiting for the next round of gruesome slayings. On the 50th anniversary of the Tate-LaBianca murders, Linda Deutsch, the Associated Press reporter who broke the story of the Cielo Drive killings, described the mood of the city to Tara Brown of 60 Minutes Australia.
You had a city that was in lockdown. People were buying alarm systems for their houses. People carried guns.
Deutsch continued to say, people were sure that they were targets, and then when the LaBiancas were killed, that sort of cemented the idea that there were mad killers on the loose. Vincent Bugliosi told KABC-TV in 2015, there was a lot of fear in LA. The sale of guard dogs and guns rose dramatically overnight, particularly in the movie colony. They were just terrified. On August 16, 1969, authorities raided Spahn Ranch and arrested Manson and 25 family members. Charged with auto theft, Manson was released when it was discovered that the arrest warrant had been misdated. As documented in Helter Skelter, Susan Atkins, jailed at the Sybil Brand Institute after being implicated in the earlier murder of music teacher Gary Hinman, leaked details of the Tate-LaBianca crimes to fellow inmates, who in turn alerted authorities. Charged with murder, Manson, Tex Watson, Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were sentenced to death. In exchange for immunity, Linda Kasabian became a witness for the prosecution. Her testimony was instrumental in convicting Manson and his followers. As reported by Rolling Stone, Steve Grogan was sentenced to life imprisonment for the family's murder of ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea. Paroled in 1985, Grogan is the only one of the killers who's been released from prison. In 1972, California abolished the death penalty. The sentences of murderers were commuted to life. Susan Atkins died of brain cancer in 2009. Charles Manson, suffering from colon cancer, died of cardiac arrest in 2017. What happens when a person with thoughts of taking their own life is encouraged to follow through with it? Michelle Carter was perceived as an instigator and accomplice in her boyfriend Conrad Roy's suicide. But the case was more than complicated. Keep watching for the horrific true story behind Hulu's The Girl from Plainville. Warning, this video contains many references to suicide. If you or anyone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK 8255. Conrad Roy's struggles with his mental health wasn't unfamiliar territory for the teenage couple. Mass Live reported that Roy had attempted to take his life in 2012 by overdosing on acetaminophen. This unsuccessful attempt occurred just after Roy had been released from a treatment program. Despite her son's history of mental health struggles, his mother Lynn didn't believe anything was out of the ordinary with Conrad, up to the day that he passed. In court during Carter's trial, she testified, "I thought he was a little depressed. I thought he was doing great.
I wish I would have picked up more signs that week, that day."
She went on to describe how she and her son spent time walking on the beach the day of Roy's suicide. She recounted how Roy was joking about his future and was discussing his plans for a career.
He seemed like he was just on the right track. It seemed like everything was getting better.
What she didn't know was that during this time, Roy was actively texting with Carter, planning out the logistics of his suicide for later that day. Videos that Roy made of himself were retrieved from his computer and played in court. The New York Times stated that Roy's own words in one video described himself as a minuscule little particle on the face of this earth. He also claimed that his life was a joke. Despite Roy's struggles with his mental health, he was an excellent student with an enviable level of athletic prowess. The Cut discusses how Roy graduated from high school a month before his death, posting an impressive 3.88 GPA. Though he later declined to attend, he had also been accepted into Fitchburg State University. While in high school, Roy played baseball and was on his school's rowing team. The grandson of a successful tugboat company owner in Massachusetts, Roy had hinted that he was going to follow in those footsteps. The year that Roy passed away, he completed his training and successfully obtained his captain's license.
I do have a lot going for me. Like, I'm like a f***ing captain.
On the surface, Roy had a bright future ahead of him, but with his anxiety and depression seeming to worsen, Roy had been pushed to the edge. And the person he shared his plans for suicide with was Michelle Carter. At one point, Roy sent a text to Carter suggesting that they had become the tragic Romeo and Juliet, but Carter shot down the suggestion. She had been encouraging Roy to get professional help for some time. Carter had a long history of mental health problems of her own. According to People magazine, she had recently started taking the medication Celexa, used to treat anxiety and depression. In interviews with The Cut, Carter's former classmates describe a person who was similar to Conrad Roy in many ways. Carter was popular among her peers and was also athletic. Carter was at one time voted class clown and most likely to brighten your day.
She was, in this small community, known as a really sweet, caring young woman.
But her peers also spoke of Carter's fluctuating weight and how Carter had at one time referred to being admitted to McLean Hospital for mental health treatment. According to the 2019 HBO documentary I Love You Now Die, a two-part series about the Roy suicide case, Carter had been on psychiatric medication since the age of 14. She had also struggled with eating disorders. While both Carter and Roy lived in Massachusetts, it was their families vacationing in Florida that led to the two of them meeting. According to Esquire, Carter was in Naples visiting her grandparents in February 2012. Several doors down from where Carter was staying, Roy was being hosted by his great aunt. Carter and Roy met and began spending time together in Florida. Carter was 1 year Roy's junior, and the two of them stayed in close contact after they left Florida to return to their respective homes in Massachusetts. The relationship between Roy and Carter was mostly one that was held within the confines of digital communications. Though Roy and his family only lived about an hour from Carter's Plainville home, and may as well have been worlds apart, according to Newsweek, the relationship they had was mostly via text messages and phone calls. Esquire wrote that, according to Conrad's mother Lynn, her son and Carter had seen each other in person no more than 5 times after their initial meeting in Naples before his passing in July 2014. When Lynn testified at Carter's trial, she was questioned about Roy's suicide attempt in 2012 when he swallowed an entire bottle of Tylenol. According to Esquire, she said Roy's plot was foiled when he phoned a friend immediately afterward, the call that saved his life. But circumstances were very different in July 2014. Instead, Carter was encouraging him to complete what he started. Though she had tried without success to get Roy to seek professional help in the months leading up to his eventual suicide, Carter had a change of heart in the weeks before his death. When Roy had mentioned taking his life in the past, Carter demanded that he get treatment. Why that tone changed is up for debate. What is known is that Roy and Carter exchanged hundreds of text messages the day of his death, with Carter continually pushing Roy to follow through with the job.
Michelle Carter exploited my son's weaknesses and used him as a pawn. Where was her humanity?
Boston 25 News released the text messages between Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy from the day of Roy's death, July 13, 2014. Early that morning, Carter sent a message to Roy asking why he hadn't done it yet. After Roy replied that he was too messed up, Carter berated him for pushing it off. Throughout the day, Roy received messages from Carter that contained disturbing content. In her messages, Carter seemed to be pressing Roy to end his life. She accused him of overthinking everything and kept assuring him that his suffering would be over when he followed through. At several points throughout the day, Carter appeared to be frustrated with Roy's hesitancy. She kept trying to impress on him that the only way to be free was to end his life. And when he kept making excuses for why he hadn't followed through, Carter responded with, "I thought you wanted to do this." Early that evening, Roy pulled his pickup truck into a Kmart parking lot. The messages between Roy and Carter stopped at 6:28 p.m. the night of Roy's death, according to Boston 25 News. This left investigators with part of a picture painted by the message exchange between the two, and would later have it filled in by more statements from Carter's friend Samantha Boardman. Esquire reports that following the last text at 6:28, Roy called Carter in a call that lasted just over 42 minutes. At 7:12 p.m., Carter called Roy, with their phones connecting for over 45 minutes. 2 days later, a text between Carter and Boardman revealed a message from Carter in which she claimed responsibility for his suicide, and that she could have done something to stop him but failed to act. According to Newsweek, Carter continued to lay the foundation of her guilt by texting that Roy's death was all her fault. In this series of texts, Carter revealed that at one point, Roy became afraid and got out of his truck as it was filling with fumes. According to Carter, she verbally ordered Roy to get back inside and finish what he started. The 317 pages of text between Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy that were laid out in court chronicled the entire timeline of the conversations the two teens had regarding Roy's eventual suicide. Brought into court on a charge of involuntary manslaughter, Carter faced up to 20 years in prison. Though she was only 17 at the time of Roy's death, Carter was charged as a youthful offender instead of as a juvenile. According to Rolling Stone, this would allow for the state to seek a stiffer sentence. Carter entered a plea of not guilty at the indictment. After being charged, Carter was held on a $250,000 bond. This was posted by her parents, and she was released into their custody. Carter was prohibited from any access to social media. The Boston Globe reported that she was also barred from sending text messages to anyone outside of immediate family members. Carter's defense team argued that she had First Amendment protection against her involuntary manslaughter charge. According to Mass Live, attorney Joseph Cataldo pointed out that the state of Massachusetts doesn't have any specific laws against assisting someone in their suicide. Cataldo referenced a recent ruling by the Minnesota Supreme Court in which they ruled that encouraging suicide was protected speech. But prosecutors insisted that the encouragement for following through with the suicide is exactly what prompted Conrad Roy to finish the job. While she could have phoned the police or requested medical treatment for Roy, she did nothing. This, according to prosecutors, made her culpable in Roy's death. In the end, Carter's defense team was unsuccessful in getting her charges dismissed and was equally unsuccessful in securing a not guilty verdict. According to CNN, in June 2017, Carter was found guilty in the juvenile court in which she was tried and awaited her sentencing hearing set for August of that year. Carter was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, with 15 months to be served and the remaining 15 months to be suspended. In addition, Carter was to be on probation for 5 years following her release.
The fact that they are still of that young age offers a greater promise of rehabilitation.
In cases where a convicted person is no longer deemed an immediate threat or a flight risk, a judge may allow that person to remain free on bond post-conviction until the case is reversed or upheld on appeal. When Carter's attorneys asked for this consideration, Judge Lawrence Moniz granted their request. With the post-conviction appeal process mired in red tape, it took until February 2019 before the High Court in the state of Massachusetts made their ruling. According to CNN, the Massachusetts Supreme Court voted to uphold the lower court's conviction. This prompted Moniz to have Carter surrender herself to Bristol County authorities immediately to begin her 15-month prison sentence. Her attorneys unsuccessfully tried to get an additional stay of her sentence while appealing to the United States Supreme Court. This additional stay was denied by Moniz, but for nearly 5 years after Conrad's death, Carter remained a free woman. Judge Moniz ordered Carter to serve her time at the Bristol County House of Corrections, but ruled that she only needed to serve a total of 15 months maximum behind prison walls. Moniz suspended the remainder of the sentence and ordered 5 years probation for Carter after she was released. People magazine reports that law in Massachusetts will allow a convicted person to have up to 10 days taken off their sentence every month for good behavior. A spokesperson for the Bristol County House of Corrections told the outlet, Michelle Carter was considered a model inmate at the Bristol County House of Corrections. She took part in a lot of programs, was polite with the staff, had no problems with other inmates.
I think by keeping busy the way she did, she was able to integrate very, very well in the Women's Center.
With good behavior, this ended up reducing Carter's total time behind bars to a mere 11 months. News of her early release did not sit well with members of the Roy family. The New York Post was told by Roy's grandfather, Conrad Roy Sr., that he was, quote, disgusted with the whole system. The elder Roy continued expressing his frustration, adding, the sentence was too lenient. 15 months is nothing to a lifetime with my grandson. If you or anyone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK, 8255.